Audie Murphy remains the most decorated American combat soldier of the Second World War. Yet to the executives at Universal Pictures, he was merely a highly profitable fake cowboy. Stripped of his authentic military identity, the studio shoved him into replica Western gear and manufactured a multi-million-dollar illusion. But the gunfire on the sound stages triggered a very real, undiagnosed PTSD. Instead of authorizing medical intervention, corporate management locked him into binding agreements, forcing him to endlessly simulate the exact combat that shattered his nervous system. Why did the American public eagerly consume the calculated torture of their greatest national asset? Audie Murphy disembarked in San Antonio in the summer of 1945. The United States military officially weighed him at 130 pounds. His physical frame was severely depleted by malaria and chronic dysentery. Shrapnel fragments remained embedded in his hip and legs. He was 21 years old and neurologically shattered. The military discharged him with a permanent 50% disability rating. Army medical personnel documented severe battlefield exhaustion in his exit files. He required intensive psychiatric rehabilitation and long-term medical monitoring. The federal government offered minimal infrastructure for post-war psychological care. He received a standard pension and a train ticket back to rural Texas. The civilian world offered no immediate industrial application for his specific skill set. He knew how to command an infantry platoon under heavy artillery fire. He possessed zero formal education beyond the 5th grade. The Texas economy operated on manual labor and agricultural production. His damaged physical joints made manual labor highly problematic. Local politicians immediately recognized the utility of his military record. They organized parades and utilized his presence for municipal public relations. The commercialization of his combat history began within weeks of his discharge. He was paraded through town squares to sell war bonds and boost civic morale. The local establishment treated him as a heavily decorated municipal asset. This localized exploitation soon attracted national corporate attention. Life magazine placed his photograph on their national cover shortly after his discharge. The editorial team selected a specific angle to project wholesome American victory. They did not photograph his trembling hands or his severe insomnia. The publication distributed a sanitized, highly marketable image to millions of households. Actor James Cagney viewed this magazine cover in California. Cagney operated an independent production company alongside his brother William. The brothers required a highly visible property to launch their new corporate venture. They identified the most decorated soldier in America as a prime acquisition target. They initiated contact and offered Murphy a free trip to Hollywood. The Cagney brothers did not intend to run a charitable operation. They proposed a standard developmental contract to secure his exclusive rights. Murphy accepted the offer out of direct economic necessity. He lacked the financial reserves to refuse a paid relocation to California. The military veteran packed a single suitcase and moved into Cagney's pool house. The initial Hollywood integration phase was a catastrophic failure. Cagney provided rudimentary acting lessons, but failed to secure actual production funding. The production company hemorrhaged money and quickly dissolved their developmental roster. They terminated Murphy's contract and eliminated his primary source of income. He was stranded in Los Angeles without a viable commercial product to sell. The studio system functioned as a brutal, highly efficient cartel in the late 1940s. Major executives demanded polished, professionally trained performers who could execute dialogue efficiently. Murphy lacked vocal projection, physical stage presence, and basic theatrical timing. Casting directors assessed him strictly on his technical deficiencies. They rejected him for dozens of entry-level background roles. His financial situation rapidly deteriorated into outright poverty during his initial years as a civilian. He slept on the floor of a local gymnasium owned by a friend. He relied on small, informal loans from sympathetic acquaintances to purchase food. The combat veteran experienced the total collapse of his civilian transition plan. The American hero was effectively homeless within 3 years of the German surrender. The psychological toll of this economic failure compounded his untreated combat trauma. He experienced violent night terrors that physically destroyed his sleeping quarters. He began keeping a loaded firearm within immediate reach at all times. This was a direct survival reflex hardwired into his brain at the Colmar pocket. The civilian environment offered no decompression protocol for this hyper-vigilant state. The Hollywood establishment remained entirely indifferent to his neurological deterioration. Studio executives viewed personal instability strictly as a corporate liability. They demanded reliable, compliant labor units to keep production schedules intact. A veteran suffering from violent flashbacks represented a severe financial risk. They effectively blacklisted him from standard casting calls. The pivot point occurred when independent producers realized his lack of acting skill was completely irrelevant. The marketing strategy required a famous name, not a theatrical performance. Producer Paul Short acquired his contract rights to leverage this military pedigree, casting him in the low-budget juvenile delinquency film Bad Boy. The production did not require complex emotional range. The director simply instructed him to stand still and project stoic intimidation. This minimalist approach successfully masked his profound discomfort in front of the camera. The film generated a modest but undeniable return on investment. Allied artists immediately noted the positive box office receipts. They recognized a highly exploitable demographic in the post-war American heartland. Millions of returning veterans and their families constituted a massive consumer base. This demographic actively purchased tickets to see the Life magazine cover boy on screen. The quality of the film was entirely secondary to the marketing hook. Universal Pictures monitored this developing revenue stream with intense corporate interest. They specialized in high-volume, low-budget genre films designed for rural distribution. They required a steady supply of recognizable leading men to front their Western division. Universal executives initiated a formal acquisition protocol for Murphy's contract. They offered a standard 7-year binding agreement. This contract was a standard instrument of indentured corporate servitude. Universal secured absolute control over his public appearances, his image rights, and his shooting schedule. They dictated his wardrobe, his interview responses, and his approved public associations. The studio assumed total ownership of the Audie Murphy brand. The man himself was reduced to a managed biological asset. The legal department immediately sanitized his official studio biography. They systematically erased any mention of his current psychological distress. The publicity department fabricated a narrative of a well-adjusted, triumphant farm boy. They instructed journalists to focus exclusively on his combat medals and his Texas roots. The actual medical reality of his existence was strictly embargoed. Universal executives assigned him exclusively to their Western production unit. The genre required minimal dialogue and heavy physical exertion. He was instructed to ride horses, fire prop weapons, and gun down designated targets. The studio effectively ordered him to simulate combat on a daily basis. They mandated a strict 6-day work week to maximize their output. The wardrobe department fitted him for standard cowboy attire. The costume deliberately evoked the uniform of the American military frontier. They armed him with replica Colt revolvers and Winchester rifles. The visual coding was designed to trigger patriotic associations in the audience. He was officially rebranded as the ultimate American frontier lawman. The initial production schedules were relentless and physically demanding. Directors allocated minimal time for rehearsal or technical preparation. They expected the actors to hit their marks, deliver the lines, and move on. The pace was designed to minimize daily overhead costs and maximize film footage. Murphy was forced to adapt to this industrial rhythm without any foundational training. His lack of theatrical background actually served the studio's requirements perfectly. He did not argue with directors over character motivation or script logic. He treated the production schedule like a daily set of military orders. He arrived on time, wore the assigned equipment, and followed the directional commands. He functioned as a highly compliant, low-maintenance production unit. The grueling schedule left zero time for psychological recovery. He worked under intense artificial lighting in heavily manufactured environments. The constant exposure to loud noises and simulated violence kept his nervous system agitated. He returned to his rented accommodations, exhausted but unable to sleep. The cycle of extreme fatigue and hypervigilance became his permanent operational baseline. Universal Pictures immediately identified a secondary revenue stream regarding his public appearances. They required him to embark on grueling multi-state promotional tours. He was transported by train to small-town theaters across the Midwest and the South. The itinerary demanded multiple public appearances per day. He was exhibited to the public like a prize-winning agricultural commodity. Local theater owners leveraged his presence to drive concession sales and ticket volume. They organized autograph lines that lasted for hours under hot lobby lights. Murphy was contractually forbidden from displaying fatigue or irritation. He shook thousands of hands and repeated the same manufactured anecdotes. The studio mandated absolute adherence to the cheerful, stoic public persona. The physical environment of these tours directly aggravated his combat injuries. Long hours in cramped train compartments stiffened his shrapnel-damaged hip. The constant travel disrupted his already fractured sleep patterns. He was subjected to endless questioning about his specific actions during the war. Civilians aggressively demanded detailed accounts of his lethal encounters with enemy soldiers. This repetitive questioning functioned as a low-level psychological interrogation. He was forced to continuously verbally recreate the most traumatic moments of his life. The public did not understand the neurological cost of these demands. They viewed his combat experience as thrilling public entertainment. The studio PR handlers stood by, ensuring he delivered the required patriotic responses. The executives at Universal tracked the tour metrics with precise accounting. They correlated his physical appearances directly to spikes in regional box office revenue. The data proved that his physical presence was a highly effective marketing tool. They integrated these grueling tours into all future contract negotiations. His off-screen time was officially monetized and scheduled by the corporate office. The early films themselves were heavily formulaic and strictly regulated. The scripts were manufactured by an internal assembly line of contract writers. The narratives rigidly adhered to established Western tropes and binary moral codes. The hero was required to remain emotionally detached and physically dominant. Murphy was never permitted to display vulnerability, hesitation, or complex internal conflict. This artistic restriction perfectly aligned with his psychological defense mechanisms. He was already actively suppressing massive internal trauma to function in civilian life. The studio paid him to project that exact same suppression onto the screen. His authentic emotional numbness was rebranded as classic Western stoicism. The audience interpreted his blank 1,000-yard stare as cinematic intensity. The directors heavily relied on extreme close-ups of his face. They understood that his eyes conveyed a very real, very dangerous coldness. This was not a practiced theatrical technique. It was the residual effect of a man who had confirmed dozens of kills. The camera captured the authentic deadness of a specialized combat operative. The major industry publications reinforced this highly profitable illusion. Variety and The Hollywood Reporter reviewed his early films strictly as commercial products. They praised his action sequences and his marketability to the teenage demographic. Nobody in the professional critical establishment questioned the ethics of his employment. The trade papers treated him as a successful industrial component within the studio machine. Within a few short years, the transformation was fully solidified. The impoverished, neurologically damaged veteran had been successfully integrated into the corporate structure. He was generating consistent, predictable profits for Universal Pictures. His private reality was entirely disconnected from his public brand. The foundation for a multi-decade exploitation campaign was securely in place. Universal Pictures accelerated their production schedule at the start of the decade. The studio executives locked Murphy into a rapid-fire sequence of low-budget westerns. He was scheduled to shoot up to 4 feature films within a single calendar year. The art departments reused the same wooden storefronts and dusty backlots for every production. The corporate strategy prioritized immense quantity over any artistic differentiation. The daily physical demands compounded his pre-existing military injuries. He rode poorly trained studio horses across hard-packed California terrain for hours. The continuous jarring impact severely aggravated the shrapnel embedded in his hip joints. Studio medical staff offered basic anti-inflammatory injections to keep him upright. They refused to authorize surgical intervention because recovery time violated the shooting schedule. His central nervous system remained in a constant state of high alert. The relentless pace of the studio system prevented any long-term psychological decompression. He reported to the sound stages before dawn and left long after sunset. The manufactured stress of learning lines and hitting marks replaced the adrenaline of combat. His brain substituted the pressure of corporate performance for battlefield survival. Murphy had previously co-authored his military memoirs under severe financial duress. Ghostwriter David McClure actually manufactured the prose to ensure commercial readability. The book generated substantial revenue and landed on national bestseller lists. Universal Pictures executives immediately recognized a massive untapped intellectual property asset. They owned the man, but they now wanted to own his actual combat history. The studio board of directors eventually initiated formal meetings to adapt the bestseller. They calculated the precise box office potential of an official Audie Murphy biographical film. The financial projections indicated a multi-million-dollar return on a relatively low-budget war picture. Executives dispatched producers to inform the actor of his next primary assignment. They did not frame this as a collaborative artistic endeavor. Murphy initially rejected the proposal with absolute finality. He possessed enough residual self-awareness to understand the danger of the project. He explicitly told the studio brass that he would not recreate the European theater. He refused to monetize the specific locations where his platoon members were eliminated. His refusal directly threatened a massive corporate revenue stream. Universal Pictures deployed their legal department to enforce compliance. The studio lawyers reminded him of the exclusivity clauses embedded in his contract. They threatened him with immediate suspension without pay if he rejected the assignment. A suspension would instantly freeze his income and trigger massive personal debt. The corporate entity effectively held his financial survival hostage. The actor possessed no leverage against a major Hollywood conglomerate. He surrendered to the studio's demands to protect his fragile economic stability. He signed the secondary agreements, authorizing the production of To Hell and Back. He officially sold the rights to his own trauma for a standard studio paycheck. The pre-production phase commenced immediately following his capitulation. The art directors transformed the Southern California landscape into the European front. They utilized bulldozers to carve imitation trenches into the dry dirt. The prop department manufactured hundreds of replica German uniforms and plastic weapons. The entire operation was a grotesque, highly organized corporate pantomime of mass destruction. They were building a playground to exploit a severe neurological vulnerability. The wardrobe department subjected him to a deeply disturbing fitting session. They tailored a brand new pristine infantry uniform to match his exact 1945 measurements. They pinned replica medals onto the fabric with clinical precision. He was forced to stand in front of three-way mirrors and look at his past self. The visual trigger immediately elevated his resting heart rate and induced heavy sweating. The casting directors hired young, inexperienced actors to play his deceased platoon members. These men possessed no military background and treated the production as an exciting career opportunity. They joked between takes and complained about the catering services. Murphy was forced to watch these actors wear the names of men he saw neutralized in combat. The studio expected him to form artificial bonds with these replacements on camera. The director of photography utilized multiple Panavision cameras to capture the action. The technical crew rigged the back lot with industrial-grade squibs and explosive charges. They buried compressed air cannons in the dirt to simulate artillery impacts. The sound department prepared massive amplification systems for the battlefield audio. The environment was engineered to deliver maximum sensory overload to the viewing audience. When principal photography for the combat sequences commenced, the assistant directors yelled for absolute silence across the massive outdoor set. The pyrotechnic technicians activated the primary smoke machines, obscuring the California sun. The director called for action over a heavy megaphone. The artificial war officially commenced around a man who had barely survived the real one. The first synchronized explosions detonated 50 feet from his position. The concussive wave hit his chest cavity with physical force. The sound of blank machine gun fire echoed off the surrounding hills. His frontal cortex immediately failed to process the environment as a simulated movie set. His amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, entirely overrode his logical reasoning. This was a severe documented medical event unfolding on a highly regulated schedule, far removed from any theatrical method acting. The combination of uniform, smoke, and concussive noise bypassed his psychological defenses. He was instantly transported back to the freezing mud of the Colmar pocket. His nervous system initiated a full-scale life-or-death survival. The cameras continued rolling as his body took over. He dropped to the dirt with a velocity that bruised his knees and elbows. He gripped his prop M1 rifle with enough force to turn his knuckles white. His breathing became shallow, rapid, and highly erratic. Sweat poured down his face, ruining the meticulously applied studio makeup. He barked aggressive, unscripted orders at the young actors surrounding him. He utilized authentic tactical maneuvers to crawl through the artificial mud. His eyes scanned the tree line with genuine, terrifying paranoia. He was actively hunting phantom enemy combatants while the crew watched from behind safety shields. He was fighting a war that had ended 10 years prior. The technical crew recognized that something was fundamentally wrong with the leading man. Grip workers and camera operators noted his extreme pallor and uncontrollable tremors between takes. Nobody on the production staff intervened or called for medical assistance. They were union employees instructed to keep the cameras operating until the director yelled "cut." The schedule dictated that the footage had to be secured at all costs. The production eventually moved to the most critical scene in the script. They required him to recreate his Medal of Honor action atop a burning tank destroyer. The prop department rigged a decommissioned armored vehicle with controlled propane fires. They positioned him on the chassis with a functional .50 caliber machine gun firing blanks. The heat from the flames physically singed the hair on his arms. The director ordered the special effects team to maximize the smoke and noise. Murphy stood on the burning metal, firing the heavy weapon into the manufactured fog. The rhythmic recoil of the gun hammered against his damaged skeletal structure. He completely lost contact with his present reality. He was trapped in a continuous loop of his most horrific operational deployment. When the director finally called cut, the illusion ended for the crew. The technicians turned off the propane valves and began resetting the cameras. Murphy did not immediately power down. He remained mounted on the tank, his hands locked onto the weapon's grips. An assistant director had to physically pry his fingers off the trigger mechanism. Universal executives reviewed the unedited film reels in comfortable, air-conditioned screening rooms. They watched the raw footage of his neurological collapse projected onto a massive screen. The corporate officers did not see a man requiring urgent psychiatric hospitalization. They saw millions of dollars in highly marketable, undeniable on-screen tension. They congratulated the director for extracting such an intense performance from a limited actor. The studio public relations department immediately weaponized the footage. They built the entire marketing campaign around the authenticity of the combat sequences. They distributed press releases boasting that the audience would witness the real war. The marketing materials explicitly promised a visceral, unfiltered look at the hero in action. They sold tickets to watch a veteran undergo severe psychological torture. Universal forced him to attend the massive Hollywood premiere of the film. They required him to wear a tuxedo and walk the red carpet under heavy flash photography. The flashing bulbs mimicked the strobe effect of artillery fire. He stood rigid, his jaw clenched while industry executives shook his hand. He was forced to sit in a dark theater and watch his own mental breakdown formatted in Technicolor. To Hell and Back became an absolute financial juggernaut upon release. It shattered Universal's previous box office records and held that title for 2 decades. The studio raked in unprecedented capital from both domestic and international markets. The film secured the company's financial stability for the remainder of the 1950s. The executives distributed massive corporate bonuses based on the film's gross revenue. Murphy received his standard contracted salary for the production. He did not receive back-end points or a percentage of the gross profits. The studio legally retained all the financial upside of his localized trauma. He generated a fortune for men who never wore a uniform or heard a gunshot. He returned to his standard Western production schedule the following week. The production fundamentally altered his baseline psychological state. The forced re-traumatization dismantled whatever fragile coping mechanisms he had built since 1945. His night terrors returned with unprecedented violence and frequency. He began carrying a loaded weapon in his vehicle and on his person. The studio had permanently widened the cracks in his neurological foundation. He could not explain his deteriorating condition to his civilian colleagues. The Hollywood environment operated on superficial charm and calculated networking. He was surrounded by executives and actors who entirely lacked his operational context. He retreated into deep emotional isolation to protect himself from further exploitation. He became a high-functioning ghost haunting the Universal lot. The studio medical staff ignored the obvious signs of his escalating crisis. They noted his weight loss and erratic behavior on set, but filed no formal reports. Documenting his instability would require the studio to halt production and lose money. They adopted a policy of aggressive, intentional blindness regarding his health. They required him to stay functional just long enough to finish the next script. Following the success of the biopic, the studio demanded more violent westerns. They realized the audience responded positively to the cold, aggressive edge he displayed. The directors instructed him to inject that same combat paranoia into his cowboy roles. They wanted the traumatized soldier layered over the standard Western hero. They actively demanded the very symptoms that were destroying him internally. He handled replica firearms on set with disturbing, hyper-realistic efficiency. He did not perform the stylized, theatrical gun spinning of other Western stars. He executed quick, brutal, tactical draws designed to neutralize a target instantly. The directors loved the cold efficiency of his movements. They did not care that his muscle memory was tied directly to lethal military engagements. The physical requirements of the productions increased exponentially. The directors designed elaborate ambush sequences and high-speed horse pursuits. They demanded multiple takes under exhausting California heat. The combination of heat, physical exertion, and simulated gunfire constantly triggered his autonomic nervous system. He spent his workdays hovering on the edge of a full panic response. His hypervigilance bled directly into his offset life. He installed floodlights and heavy security measures at his private residence. He perceived basic civilian interactions as potential threat scenarios. He alienated friends and family members with his sudden volatile mood swings. The boundaries between the dangerous movie sets and his safe reality completely dissolved. Studio management used his isolation as a control mechanism. They knew he had no viable support network outside the studio system. They constantly reminded him that his entire livelihood depended on their goodwill. They utilized his fear of returning to post-war poverty to enforce total compliance. He was trapped in a highly lucrative, heavily monitored corporate prison. As he approached his 30th birthday, the youthful, innocent appearance that initially made him famous was beginning to fade. The deep lines on his face reflected the extreme internal stress of his daily existence. The studio makeup department used heavier cosmetics to mask his physical deterioration. They were actively patching up the asset to keep it viable for the camera. The completion of To Hell and Back marked the end of his peak commercial value. The studio had extracted the ultimate prize, his actual war record. They possessed the definitive Audie Murphy product in their vault. The remaining years of his contract would be focused on pure, low-budget volume. He was officially transitioned from a special project to standard industrial output. Universal's B Western division operated with factory-like precision. They generated scripts using a strict, unvarying template designed for mass consumption. The narratives required a stoic protagonist, a designated antagonist, and a mandatory shootout in the third act. These productions were not designed to win critical awards or advance cinematic art. They were manufactured purely to fill the lower half of double-feature theater billings. The studio demanded an output of 3 to 4 pictures annually from Murphy. This relentless quota left no margin for error or delay on the sound stages. Directors shot scenes in single takes to conserve expensive 35mm film stock. The lighting setups were rudimentary and harsh, prioritizing speed over visual aesthetics. The actor was pushed through these setups with the urgency of a factory worker on an assembly line. This industrial pace rapidly degraded his physical health. The shrapnel in his leg caused a pronounced limp that he was forced to suppress while cameras rolled. Directors explicitly ordered him to walk smoothly, forcing him to absorb the pain internally. He performed these agonizing corrections, take after take under the hot studio lights. His body was continuously punished for failing to meet the pristine visual standards of the genre. The heavy wool and leather costumes mandated by the studio exacerbated his discomfort. He wore these suffocating garments during long summer shoots in the Mojave Desert. The extreme heat caused severe dehydration and worsened his chronic stomach issues. The wardrobe department strictly prohibited any modification of the costumes for comfort. The visual integrity of the Cowboy brand superseded the basic physical needs of the human wearing it. Murphy attempted to assert minor control over his career by requesting script changes. He asked to play darker, more morally ambiguous characters to break the monotonous heroism. The studio executives immediately vetoed these requests with standard corporate boilerplate. They explicitly told him that the audience paid for the hero, not the actor. They rigidly enforced his confinement within the two-dimensional archetype they had purchased. The publicity department worked overtime to maintain the facade of a happy Hollywood star. They arranged fake dates with studio starlets to generate positive gossip column inches. They staged photographs of him enjoying fabricated hobbies like golf and horseback riding. These carefully orchestrated PR stunts were designed to counter any rumors of his off-screen volatility. The studio spent thousands of dollars annually to ensure the public never saw his true condition. Murphy detested the artificiality of the Hollywood social circuit. He felt profound alienation among the wealthy, disconnected elite of Los Angeles. He recognized that his colleagues respected his fame, but fundamentally misunderstood his trauma. He frequently skipped mandatory industry parties, drawing the ire of studio executives. His refusal to play the Hollywood game further isolated him from potential allies within the industry. Despite his massive fame, his actual liquid capital was tightly restricted. He signed terrible contracts early in his career that gave the studios the lion's share of the profits. He was locked into a fixed salary structure, while his films generated millions. He lacked the financial independence to walk away from the grinding production schedules. The studio utilized his economic vulnerability as the ultimate leash. When his initial contract expired, he attempted to negotiate better terms. He demanded script approval and a percentage of the box office gross. Universal executives countered with a hardline stance, threatening to replace him with newer, cheaper talent. They calculated exactly how much money he needed to maintain his lifestyle and offered just enough to keep him working. He signed the extension out of a deeply ingrained fear of returning to rural poverty. By the mid-1950s, Universal transitioned his films from black and white to Technicolor. The new film stock required significantly brighter lighting on the sets. The massive arc lamps generated intense, suffocating heat in the enclosed sound stages. The glare continuously triggered his combat-induced migraines. He performed complex action sequences while suffering from severe, blinding headaches. The directors assigned to his films were strictly pragmatic company men focused on budget and schedule over artistic vision. Their primary directive was to bring the picture in under budget and ahead of schedule. They viewed Murphy's physical and psychological limitations as frustrating logistical hurdles. They possessed no training in trauma management and showed zero empathy for his condition. Their job was to yell action and extract the required footage by any means necessary. Stunt coordinators on B-Westerns were notorious for cutting corners. They used cheap, explosive squibs that frequently caused minor burns and lacerations. They designed horse falls on hard ground without adequate safety padding. Murphy, contractually obligated to maintain his tough guy image, performed many of these hazardous setups. He absorbed the physical damage to satisfy the studio's demand for authentic action. He never formally complained to the union representatives about the unsafe conditions. The military had conditioned him to endure physical hardship without vocalizing dissent. The studio heavily relied on this ingrained stoicism to avoid workplace safety violations. They knew he would quietly suffer through dangerous stunts rather than halt production. His military discipline was weaponized against him to circumvent industry safety standards. By the end of 1955, the sheer volume of simulated violence had taken a permanent toll. He had fired thousands of blank rounds and survived hundreds of artificial explosions. His nervous system was battered by the constant, aggressive stimuli of the film sets. The line between his real combat experience and the studio's manufactured violence became fatally blurred. He was a man drowning in an ocean of fake blood and real adrenaline. The human body is not designed to sustain high-level trauma indefinitely. The adrenaline reserves that had kept him operational for a decade were finally exhausted. His natural biological defenses began to shut down under the relentless pressure. He could no longer rely on sheer willpower to get through the 12-hour shooting days. The biological machine was officially failing, and the studio required a chemical intervention to keep the assembly line moving. The studio medical department facilitated a limitless, unregulated supply of Placidil, bypassing standard pharmacy protocols. As his tolerance escalated, the required dosage induced severe chemical hangovers, compromised his motor skills, and engineered a full-blown chemical dependency. Executives monitored his physical deterioration, including extreme weight loss, tremors, and intense withdrawal symptoms when he attempted to quit, but viewed the addiction strictly as an effective retention tool. The daily combination of heavy sedatives, brutal physical stunt work, and alcohol severely damaged his internal organs. Universal successfully trapped him in a closed loop, relying on chemical suppression to meet their grueling production quota, reducing the American icon to heavily medicated industrial machinery. The Hollywood economic landscape shifted violently as the rapid national adoption of household television sets decimated traditional theatrical attendance. Universal Pictures faced a massive corporate restructuring to prevent outright bankruptcy. The executive board mandated immediate, aggressive budget cuts across all production divisions. The B-Western unit was targeted for maximum financial optimization. Studio accountants meticulously audited every single line item in the production ledgers. They identified specialized labor as the primary drain on their capital reserves. The executives demanded directors reduce shooting schedules from 30 days to less than 20. They eliminated rehearsal time, downgraded film stock quality, and slashed the catering budgets. The entire apparatus transitioned from a creative studio to a hyper-efficient manufacturing plant. Audie Murphy remained their most reliable, low-cost revenue generator during this financial crisis. He held a fixed-rate contract that insulated the studio from wage inflation. Universal greenlit a highly cynical project titled No Name on the Bullet to capitalize on his brand. The script featured a professional assassin who terrorizes a town simply by sitting in a chair and staring. It was a production designed requiring minimal physical sets and heavily compressed filming locations. The director assigned to the project immediately recognized a severe change in the lead actor. Murphy was operating under the crushing weight of a multi-year Placidil addiction. His central nervous system had effectively shut down its emotional processing centers. He did not arrive on set looking like a rugged, energetic cowboy hero. He arrived displaying the clinical symptoms of profound psychological dissociation. Dissociation is a severe psychiatric defense mechanism triggered by continuous, inescapable trauma. The human brain completely severs the connection between conscious awareness and the physical environment. Murphy's eyes appeared entirely vacant, stripped of all standard human micro-expressions. His vocal delivery flattened into a monotonous mechanical drone devoid of natural inflection. He was physically present on the soundstage, but his consciousness had completely evacuated the premises. The studio director did not call for a medical intervention or halt the production. He recognized this catastrophic neurological failure as highly valuable free production value. He instructed the camera operators to utilize extreme, tight close-ups of Murphy's deadened face. The director weaponized the actor's clinical dissociation to fit the profile of the script's sociopathic assassin. The production exploited his literal mental absence as a deliberate, calculated artistic choice. He hit his tape marks on the floor with robotic, unthinking precision. He recited his dialogue without a single trace of empathy, fear, or hesitation. The heavy sedatives in his bloodstream eradicated his natural startle reflexes. The camera captured the chilling, authentic emptiness of a man who had been completely hollowed out. The studio successfully monetized a severe psychiatric crisis and packaged it as premium entertainment. When No Name on the Bullet was released to the public, the critical establishment was entirely deceived. Major newspaper reviewers praised Murphy's performance as a brilliant, minimalist masterclass in tension. They wrote extensive analyses detailing his sophisticated, restrained acting technique. They completely misinterpreted his chemical numbness as calculated artistic brilliance. The industry celebrated the absolute destruction of his psyche as a career-defining triumph. Universal capitalized on the critical success of his psychological dissociation by further slashing overhead, explicitly eliminating stunt doubles for his productions. Directors weaponized Murphy's ingrained military pride, forcing him to absorb extreme physical trauma, including high-speed horse falls without padding, concussive pyrotechnic blasts, and blunt force impacts to circumvent standard Screen Actors Guild hazard fees. He was officially downgraded from a leading man to a highly disposable crash test dummy. The aftermath of these kinetic impacts was managed entirely off the official production books. Studio physicians bypassed hospital protocols, administering heavy industrial cortisone injections directly into his shattered joints to keep him functional on camera. This relentless physical battering compounded his placidal addiction, leaving him with irreversible spinal damage, a permanent limp, and a deeply toxic dependency on alcohol by the end of 1959. The studio accepted his physical destruction as a standard operating cost of doing business. The extreme physical exhaustion began to manifest in his interactions with the studio hierarchy. He refused to participate in the mandatory promotional tours that had defined his early career. He physically lacked the stamina to shake thousands of hands and smile under hot lobby lights. The publicity department filed formal complaints against him for breach of contract. The executives threatened to withhold his standard paycheck if he did not comply with marketing demands. He recognized the complete transactional nature of his existence within the Hollywood system. He was surrounded by executives who treated him with superficial respect while actively grinding him into dust. He developed a deep, bitter cynicism toward the entire entertainment industry. He openly mocked the scripts he was handed, reading the lines with deliberate, heavy sarcasm during rehearsals. The directors simply ordered him to deliver the lines straight and move on to the next setup. his private life fractured completely under the weight of the physical and chemical burden. He spent his offset hours locked inside his home, isolated from his family and former military colleagues. The chronic pain prevented him from engaging in any normal civilian recreational activities. He sat in darkened rooms, his loaded pistol resting on the table beside his prescription bottles. The studio had successfully transformed the national hero into a heavily armed, severely damaged recluse. The end of the decade marked the absolute depletion of his biological reserves. The Universal Pictures machine had extracted every possible drop of value from his combat history. They had monetized his trauma, chemically enslaved his nervous system, and physically broken his body. He had fulfilled his contractual obligations and generated immense wealth for the corporate shareholders. He was about to enter the 1960s with a broken body, a heavy addiction, and a massive financial deficit. The industry was rapidly evolving, and the traditional Western genre was losing its cultural dominance. The studio executives began to view his aging, battered appearance as a depreciating asset. They had already optimized the costs of his production. The next logical step was total systemic liquidation. The machinery of Hollywood was preparing to transition him from a highly profitable asset to an expendable liability. The foundation for his complete financial and professional collapse was entirely solidified by the close of 1959. To simulate the adrenaline of combat, Murphy developed a severe gambling addiction, placing massive unsecured wagers at racetracks and Las Vegas casinos. This behavior rapidly incinerated his capital exactly as Universal terminated his contract in the early 1960s. Furthermore, the studio retained 100% of the distribution rights for the television syndication of his films, leaving him with zero residual income, trapped between mob-connected bookmakers, demanding immediate payment and aggressive IRS audits for undocumented losses. Murphy was forced to liquidate his quarter-horse ranches and accept dangerous, low-budget freelance roles in Europe to hide income. The insurmountable debt, combined with his unchecked placidal addiction, culminated in a formal bankruptcy declaration in 1968, stripping him of all accumulated wealth and destroying his domestic stability. The American cultural landscape shifted violently as the decade closed. The escalation of the Vietnam War fundamentally altered the domestic consumer market. The teenage demographic actively rejected the traditional military narratives of the 1940s and 1950s. College campuses became zones of active protest against the federal government and the armed forces. The classic, stoic American soldier was rapidly rebranded as a symbol of systemic oppression. Hollywood executives possess a singular, highly refined instinct for tracking market demographics. The major studios immediately recognized this massive ideological shift in their ticket-buying audience. They ordered a complete cessation of all traditional patriotic war film productions. The production slates were rapidly filled with counterculture narratives and anti-establishment anti-heroes. The industry pivoted entirely toward the new youth culture to maintain their profit margins. Audie Murphy was caught completely exposed in this brutal industrial transition. His entire public brand was inextricably linked to the military-industrial complex. He represented the exact ideology that the new consumer base was actively protesting. Studio executives viewed his physical presence as an obsolete, highly toxic marketing liability. They systematically erased his name from all future casting consideration lists. He was essentially locked out of the corporate fortress he had helped build. The studio gates were permanently closed to the aging, heavily damaged veteran. He could not secure even a minor supporting role in a major studio production. The executives who previously managed his daily schedule refused to acknowledge his existence. The Hollywood machine executed a flawless, cold-blooded excommunication of a depreciated asset. He possessed zero institutional support to navigate this sudden professional exile. The Screen Actors Guild offered no retraining programs or transition assistance for obsolete leading men. The major talent agencies officially dropped him from their client rosters to avoid the association. He was left entirely to his own devices in a highly predatory civilian market. The corporate safety net simply did not exist for disposable contracted labor. Decades of desperation culminated in a final attempt to finance an independent micro-budget feature titled A Time for Dying. He hired veteran director Bud Boticher to helm the project on a strict accelerated schedule. The production lacked standard studio infrastructure, operating on a skeleton crew and deferred payments. It was a massive financial gamble designed strictly to generate emergency liquid cash. The physical production of this film was a testament to his profound biological depletion. He did not possess the stamina to play the leading role. He restricted himself to a minor, heavily abbreviated cameo appearance as Jesse James. He arrived on the dusty, low-rent set looking haggard, gray, and physically diminished. The camera captured the undeniable, irreversible decay of the former box office icon. His performance in the cameo lacked all the calculated intensity of his early career. He delivered his lines with a hollow, exhausted rasp that could not be disguised by audio mixing. His hands visibly trembled while handling the replica firearms required for the scene. The heavy sedatives and chronic joint pain had finally eroded his basic motor functions entirely. He was a physically broken man pantomiming the echoes of his own fabricated legend. The completion of the film did not trigger the financial rescue he required. The major distribution networks uniformly rejected the final cut of the picture. Theater chains refused to allocate screen time to a gritty, low-budget Western featuring an obsolete star. The film was shelved entirely, generating zero revenue for the heavily indebted investors. The final attempt to leverage his cinematic brand ended in absolute commercial failure. The failure of the production eliminated his last remaining legitimate income stream. He was forced to aggressively expand his associations with highly questionable financial operators. He attended clandestine meetings in dingy hotel rooms, seeking short-term, high-interest loans. He associated with men who possessed extensive criminal records and pending federal indictments. His social circle devolved entirely into a network of desperate hustlers and con artists. This toxic environment inevitably triggered a severe, highly publicized behavioral incident when he violently intervened in a financial dispute. He intervened in a financial dispute between a female acquaintance and a dog trainer in Burbank. He confronted the trainer with a loaded firearm and engaged in a violent physical altercation. The Burbank Police Department arrived on the scene and placed the former national hero under immediate arrest. He was processed, fingerprinted, and charged with assault with intent to commit a felony. The subsequent legal proceedings drained his final remaining cash reserves. He was forced to hire defense attorneys, using money borrowed from underground syndicates. The trial was heavily covered by the national press, actively dismantling whatever remained of his heroic public image. The prosecution portrayed him as a highly volatile, heavily armed menace to civilian society. The defense successfully secured an acquittal, but the public relations damage was terminal. The trial effectively rendered him completely unemployable in any legitimate corporate capacity. No bank would authorize a loan to a bankrupt actor with a recent assault trial. No legitimate corporation would hire him as a spokesman or public relations representative. He was entirely isolated, facing insurmountable debt and daily threats from aggressive creditors. The trap engineered by a decade of studio exploitation had finally closed completely. During his final months, his daily existence was reduced to a frantic scramble for survival capital. He entered into a partnership with a group of speculative businessmen operating out of Atlanta. These men were attempting to launch a highly risky, underfunded modular housing company. They possessed zero manufacturing experience and lacked the necessary capital to secure bank financing. They required a famous name on the board of directors to legitimize the operation for potential investors. Murphy agreed to join the venture out of sheer financial starvation. He possessed no understanding of modular construction or commercial real estate development. He was simply selling the use of his name for a promised percentage of the hypothetical profits. The businessman utilized his status to secure a line of credit from regional banks. He became the public face of an operation that was structurally unsound from its inception. The executives ordered Murphy to personally inspect a failing manufacturing plant in the rural Virginia mountains, a directive he complied with purely out of financial starvation. On May 28, 1971, under severe financial pressure to close a modular housing deal, Murphy boarded a chartered Aero Commander 680 in Atlanta. The unqualified pilot, lacking an instrument rating, flew directly into heavy fog and thunderstorms over the Roanoke Valley. The aircraft crashed into Brush Mountain, Virginia, instantly killing everyone on board. Following his death, Universal Pictures issued no formal statements. The IRS immediately seized his life insurance policies to cover back taxes, and his original military medals were temporarily lost during a chaotic estate liquidation. The federal government buried him at Arlington National Cemetery under a standard headstone, concluding a trajectory defined by profound military and industrial exploitation, leaving behind a highly profitable myth that successfully obscured the total neurological collapse of the man forced to construct it.